Chapter 891, Taming the Fifth Year. Attrition, Cool Defeat. The mantis began suffering damage almost immediately after the temperature descended beyond a critical point. The cold started penetrating its natural defenses faster than its body could compensate. Not instant damage, but progressive deterioration that accumulated with each passing second. The cold penetrated from all directions simultaneously in a manner that made defending effectively against the practically environmental assault impossible. Externally, the frigid air attacked its exoskeleton, which could resist physical impacts and ordinary elemental attacks, but didn't have perfect protection against extreme temperatures. Chitin was excellent armor against cutting and crushing forces, less excellent against thermal stress. The material became brittle at low temperatures, with microscopic fractures forming as the molecular structure lost flexibility. And worse still, the roots that had been feeding the mantis with stolen mana from the amphibian had now converted into channels that transmitted cold directly toward the creature's internal system. The freezing plants acted as thermal conductors that drained body heat faster than the mantis's metabolism could compensate for, an effect that accumulated with each second that passed. What had been an advantage, direct connection to an energy source, became a liability when that connection turned into a highway for heat loss. Heat flowed from warm to cold through any available pathway. The frozen plants provided excellent pathways, and the mantis, being much warmer than its surroundings, was bleeding thermal energy at a rate that was unsustainable. Being the smallest beast among the three that Ren had available and the least defensive by nature, the damage it accumulated was considerably greater than what the Hydra or Wolverine would have suffered under the same conditions. Surface-to-volume ratio was higher, meaning rapid heat exchange with the environment. The compact structure that was normally an advantage in terms of mobility converted into disadvantage. Small bodies lost heat faster than large ones. Basic thermodynamics that applied to beasts as much as to physics. And the resources the mantis had available to respond were critically low. It had cycled aggressively during the exchange with the plant invasion, spending and recovering mana in volume exceeding its base capacity multiple times. But now, with almost all the plants dead, the incoming flow of stolen energy had cooled and reduced abruptly, leaving it operating only with what remained in its own reserves. And those reserves were about to be completely exhausted. It would have between 10 and 15% remaining. With the cold intensifying and mana nearly depleted, it would be extremely difficult to reactivate the plant zone that had been so effective moments earlier. Men had almost perfectly timed, if by luck, the moment when the mantis's energy investment had been at its maximum possible commitment. The digestion boost had come right when the plant network was most extensive. Then the cold had prevented regeneration. Then the mantis found itself at critical reserves without the recovery mechanism that had been sustaining it. Perfect timing. Perfect trap. Seeds required some warmth, or at least less cold, to germinate appropriately, a process that sub-zero temperature inhibited almost completely. Germination required metabolic activity. Metabolic activity required enzymes. Enzymes stopped functioning below certain temperatures, and any attempt to force growth through massive elemental energy investment would simply drain the mantis's last reserves without achieving anything significant. Worse still, the mantis was in a position where any direct hit from the amphibian would be literally the last it could receive. No margin for exchange. Physical structure had been compromised by cold, making the exoskeleton brittle, and the energy reserves were at a level making manifestation of healing or elemental defenses to last slightly longer extremely risky. One solid hit would shatter the weakened exoskeleton. Game over. The complete focus of Ren's strategy had been wearing down the amphibian's mana through parasitic drainage, eventually reducing resources to the point where victory would become inevitable and the mantis would recover a decent quantity of mana in the final absorption. The dense field preparation that would finish the amphibian would also affect his serpent of the same element when it entered later, create an environmental advantage that would persist into subsequent exchanges. It was a plan that would have worked perfectly if men hadn't revealed a ridiculous capability like using cold to negate the wood element's advantage almost completely. And unfortunately, the amphibian would almost certainly resist any strike the mantis could launch now with the limited resources remaining, because it actually hadn't received much direct damage during the entire exchange. Massive bulk and natural defense provided durability that any lower-rank strike simply couldn't penetrate. Maybe 50 tons of mass, maybe 25 to 50 centimeters of mucus-covered hide acting as armor. Attacks weakened by exhaustion and cold couldn't begin to damage it effectively now. A huge gold-ranked defense backing durability that already exceeded what Silver 3 attacks could compromise. No path to victory. Not with these resources. It was a situation when recognized as mandatory loss. A moment where continuation would only result in receiving bond damage without realistic possibility of reversing momentum. But Ren wasn't a person who surrendered without at least attempting something that could create advantage for subsequent battle phases, even if immediate victory was unattainable. He liked efficiency like that. So he decided on an approach that seemed strange considering the circumstances, but had logic when objectives beyond simple elimination of the current opponent were considered. The Mantis wasn't particularly good at launching ranged magic, with its specialization being more in close-range combat where speed and elemental versatility could be exploited in rapid exchanges. But it wasn't weak in the broad sense when forced to operate in that mode. Compared to various common silver-rank beasts specialized in a single element, its capacity to project elemental attacks was respectable, especially when you consider that most Silver 3 beasts had maybe 60 to 70% efficiency with their primary element when compared to the Bronze 2 beast. The Mantis, even exhausted and operating in adverse conditions, still had residual advantages from the buffs and Ren's bond structure he'd cultivated. So the fireballs it launched with the little mana remaining weren't weak according to common creature standards, especially considering it was exhausted and operating in adverse conditions. Chapter 892, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition, Cool Defeat, 2. The compact projectiles of flame energy detonated with heat that would have seriously burned an opponent without appropriate defense. Total expenditure. Approximately 10% of the total mana points. Nearly everything the Mantis had left, leaving maybe 5% in reserve for emergency defensive techniques if the amphibian counterattacked during the performance. But when the fireballs impacted against the amphibian, because a few did hit it directly, they caused no damage despite the considerable energy they contained. The thick mucus layer covering its transparent skin acted as an extraordinary insulator protecting against extreme temperature in both directions. The same substance allowing the amphibian to resist the cold it generated also defended against the heat that fire attacks attempted to inflict, a barrier that dispersed thermal energy before it could penetrate to underlying tissues. The mucus was thick across most of the body, composed of complex proteins and polysaccharides that had extremely high specific heat capacity, meaning they could absorb enormous amounts of thermal energy with minimal temperature change. When fire struck, the outer layer of mucus absorbed the heat, preventing it from reaching the skin beneath. When cold radiated outward, the same layer insulated the amphibian's core body temperature from the extreme cold it was projecting. It was the same reason the amphibian could withstand its own explosions without significant effort. The chemical detonations occurred at the mucus surface. The mucus absorbed the thermal energy and the shock. The underlying tissues remained protected. Men observed the attacks with an expression of momentary confusion, processing why Run would be spending the Mantis's last resources on a technique that clearly wasn't damaging his beast. Was it desperation? A panicked response from someone who didn't know what else to do? Run. Min called across the arena with genuine puzzlement. What are you? Then his eyes widened slightly as understanding arrived. The answer became clear when you noticed the effect on the environment rather than the effect on the amphibian directly. The zone around where the fireballs detonated heated notably, with local temperature rising several degrees as flame energy dispersed into the arena. and a good portion of the frost that had covered the sand began melting under the influence of residual heat, with ice converting back to water that soaked into the ground again. Not enough to reverse conditions completely. The amphibian still radiated cold that maintained the arena's center frozen. But it was partial mitigation that would make it easier for Ren's next beast to operate the wood element without it being immediately at a disadvantage from hostile ambient temperature. Ground conditions in melted zones, muddy but no longer frozen solid. Roots could potentially penetrate. Seeds could potentially germinate if given enough energy. Plants could potentially establish themselves. Clever, Min said quietly, his earlier confusion resolving into respect. He understood now. Ren wasn't trying to damage the amphibian with those last attacks. Wasn't flailing, desperately hoping something would work. Was deliberately investing final resources in battlefield preparation that would pay dividends for the Hydra or Wolverine when they entered. It was the kind of thinking that separated good tamers from great ones. Recognizing when a battle was lost and immediately shifting focus to the next battle rather than wasting resources trying to salvage the unsalvageable. It was an investment in the future rather than an attempt to win in the present, a calculated use of the mantis's last resources. The environmental modification was subtle but meaningful. Not warm, but above freezing. Workable conditions for plant growth if properly supported with mana. But Min had recognized the intention finally. "You're not getting a free setup," he shouted while ordering an attack that would finish the exchange before the mantis could contribute more to the preparations. The amphibian fired massive water jets, hydraulic projection crossing the distance between combatants in a fraction of a second. The water pressure was enormous. Kinetic energy to the level of being able to punch through reinforced concrete at close range. But they were still slow attacks by the mantis's normal speed standards. Yet the exhaustion and cold had compromised its legendary agility. And if they connected directly, they would completely crush the mantis. The pressure would be adequate to fracture its exoskeleton and sever the bond through massive trauma. Also, the mantis was still connected to the roots it had established during the previous battle phase, even though most of the plants were dead and frozen. Those roots had worked to withstand the push from the explosions and to absorb energy from a good, safe distance, but now provided anchors that prevented executing the last-second evasive maneuvers needed. However, thinking quickly, it generated a small but thick barrier of rock in front of itself, positioned diagonally toward the ground. The barrier appeared fast, being short-distance control connected to its feet, but it needed to crouch. The water impacted the barrier, and it barely resisted the pressure. The rock creaked. Fractures appeared. The structure would hold for maybe 1 to 2 seconds under the sustained hydraulic assault. But the diagonal angle directed the water downward rather than allowing it to continue toward the mantis. The deflected water struck the ground with enormous force, displacing sand and frozen soil beneath the mantis's position. The ground shifted. The root anchors loosened as their connections were undermined by the churning earth freeing the beast. The mantis jumped at exactly the right moment. Right before the rock barrier collapsed under pressure, it could no longer redirect into the subground without a support point. The leap was not graceful, not the fluid motion it would normally execute, but sufficient to escape the collapsing barrier and the redirected water that had been about to crush it. The rock barrier shattered completely under the continued water pressure, fragmenting into pieces that scattered across the arena floor. The water jets continued for another second before Min cut them off, recognizing the attack had missed. The fire attacks had been interrupted before the mantis could launch the final 2 to 3 fireballs it had been preparing. But it didn't have too many remaining anyway, and was already at 5% reserves after making the wall. And then, recognizing that there was no way to continue effectively with the exhausted resources and accumulated damage, Run gave the mantis rest. The creature disappeared in a flash of light, marking retreat to its tamer's core. Voluntary withdrawal. Tactical surrender, preserving what remained of the bond rather than receiving damage from continuing when a victory for the mantis or even any more help to the next beast was impossible. Chapter 893, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition Order. The Mantis's physical form converted back to pure energy. The beast code flowed back along the bond connection to Ren's mana core. The manifestation ended cleanly without the jarring disruption that came from force bond severance through excessive damage. Ren felt the feedback through their connection, some exhaustion and channel strain from excessive mana cycling. Master Yang raised his hand to signal the result officially. First partial victory, Team Luna. The audience erupted in applause and excited conversations about the exchange they had witnessed. It had been a confrontation that had oscillated between the combatants multiple times, with momentum shifting back and forth as each side revealed cards and countercards. And the final twist, where men had revealed the capacity to manipulate temperature, had been a moment that nobody would forget anytime soon. Two ice-capable tamers in the same generation. Statistical improbability that scholars would be analyzing for years. The volume of conversation in the stands was deafening. Ren observed the amphibian still on the field while considering options for the next combatant. The creature was certainly tired, had spent considerable resources on its cold technique and in executing multiple explosions. But it wasn't nearly as exhausted as the Mantis had been. Gold rank reserves provided depth, allowing it to absorb losses that would have incapacitated a lower rank beast. And more importantly, it had barely received any direct damage throughout the entire exchange. Maybe 5 to 8% of its total durability was compromised through minor burns and superficial wood element damage before the cold technique cleared the planned invasion. Nothing it couldn't heal in a second. Just tired and depleted, but fundamentally intact. Ren needed to decide which of his two remaining beasts he would send against the amphibian. As he had been supposing during previous planning, the Hydra should be saved because he still didn't know when Luna would deploy her wolf. That confrontation would be critical and would require having a beast with specific elemental advantage available, particularly the enhanced capacity to use light to counteract the wolf's inclination toward darkness and good resistance. Light versus darkness wasn't an absolute counter like water versus fire, but it was a meaningful advantage, which meant his Wolverine would enter first against the amphibian. And thanks to the Mantis's efforts in reducing the temperature with the last-moment fire attacks, it wouldn't be terribly difficult for the beast with considerably superior elemental control to finish an amphibian with low mana reserves. The melted zones the Mantis had created would allow immediate plant growth without needing to overcome frozen soil conditions first. The amphibian's cold generation capability had been demonstrated, which meant it could be countered rather than surprising the Wolverine. The explosive defenses were known and could be adapted to. The energy reserves were depleted to levels where extended combat would favor the fresh opponent. Easy mode. Ren activated his second bond and allowed the Wolverine to manifest in the arena. The creature materialized with the same presence it had on the semi-final communicating power over the elements. It was the difference between level 3 and 6 of cultivation, a gap of 3 levels. The disparity that became obvious in direct comparison when both beasts belonged to the same tamer and shared buffs and similar training methodologies. Basically better in every stat, but more important than raw physical stats was the mana capacity and control sophistication. The Jade Wolverine's mana reserves were already big for the rare variant and around the same in mana points, but more than double what the amphibian currently had available, if taking into account all efficiency-related buffs. More than 20 times what the Mantis had possessed at full capacity. The amphibian's control efficiency was solid for Gold 1, but not too exceptional if taking the double tamer's extra buffs out. The gap in both capacity and efficiency meant the Wolverine could accomplish more with less expenditure while having deeper reserves to draw from. Overwhelming advantage that numbers alone couldn't fully capture. It evaluated the field in an instant with senses processing elemental information on multiple levels simultaneously. Temperature distribution, soil moisture, and frozen colder areas. Residual mana signatures if the amphibian's water and cold essence still dominant but fading. Mantis's wood and fire traces scattered throughout. Min's mana imprint on the entire battlefield from his last technique usage. Available resources were abundant water, moderate organic material from dead frozen plants, ample mineral content in the sand for earth manipulation. Conditions favorable for wood element assault with water and light support. Amphibian vulnerable. Victory within 5 minutes. And then the Wolverine executed a technique demonstrating exactly why rank disparity mattered so much when both sides shared similar retroactive enhancement bonuses. Plants surged from the ground on a scale completely eclipsing what the Mantis had accomplished. Not dozens, but hundreds of structures sprouting simultaneously from points distributed throughout the complete arena. Not gradual growth that could be interrupted, but nearly instantaneous manifestation, with refined elemental control converting the frozen remains and saturated soil into rapid aggressive growth. The mechanism was fundamentally different from what the Mantis had done. The Mantis had operated by imbuing seeds with wood mana and launching them toward targets. The resulting plants had needed continuous energy input to grow aggressively. The entire process had been relatively slow and mana-intensive because the Mantis lacked the control to command the element at range efficiently. The Wolverine simply commanded the element at distance directly, with wood responding to its will with what seemed like absolute obedience. No launching seeds, no germination delay, and no continuous energy input required once the initial structure was established. Just pure elemental manipulation that raised mana plants from available organic matter and mana without intermediate steps. And the efficiency was staggering. Roots grew upward from the ground, reaching toward the amphibian's legs and lower body. Much thicker than what the Mantis had managed. Harder to destroy and more resilient to explosive counterattacks. Mantis root diameter more than doubled on average, and in structural differences, it got approximately 8 times greater cross-sectional area, translating to dramatically higher durability. And these roots weren't just larger, but also more sophisticated in their construction. Chapter 894, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition, Order 2. The Wolverine's mastery over wood element meant it could create internal structures that mimicked advanced high gold rank botanical architecture. The amphibian attempted to resist, with its massive body generating intensified cold in an effort to replicate the situation that had worked so well against the Mantis. The temperature began dropping again. It was investing its remaining reserves into the technique that had delivered victory previously. But the magnitude of the new attack was incomparable to what it had faced before. And the Wolverine that was highly adept at elemental projections at range was saving enormous quantities of mana that the Mantis would have needed to accomplish the same effects. Where the Mantis had imbued from its body and planted launch seeds, the Wolverine simply commanded the element at distance directly. The mana cost difference was substantial, meaning less expenditure for equivalent output when working at range, and since the control was huge, also meaning a way bigger, lushier forest. The amphibian's fundamental weakness against wood remained even when it had developed strategies against that element. Wood still drained water. That was the core relationship in the elemental cycle. Water nourished wood, but wood also consumed water. And when the wood was backed by a beast with exceptional elemental control, facing a depleted Gold 1 beast, trying to defend with a good but still fake element, cold, rather than its primary affinity, water, because that would be bad too, then the contest became increasingly one-sided. The amphibian tried maintaining as much cold as possible to combat the plants, threatening to establish complete dominance over it again. Temperature descended further near the center of the arena as the creature invested its last reserves in the technique that had worked perfectly against the Mantis. The air became painful to breathe, and frost accumulated on every surface at accelerating rates. But the Wolverine was not the Mantis. It had considerably more refined control over the elements. The capacity to coordinate responses that negated any advantages the opponent attempted exploiting. The distance control and its advantage in efficiency became increasingly evident with every passing second. It countered the amphibian's attempts to increase the chill by feeding the plant's power with a precise combination of water, light, and controlled heat that perfectly counteracted the sub-zero temperature. Not simply heating the area indiscriminately, but specific manipulation of environmental conditions that seem to go around each individual plant and root. Where the amphibian generated cold, the wolverine projected heat exactly sufficient to neutralize without wasting power on excess. Where photosynthesis required light, soft but constant glow provided the resource amplified by mana. The precision was remarkable. Each plant received almost individualized support calibrated to its specific needs and exposure to cold. Plants closer to the amphibian received more heating. Plants farther away received less. No wasted energy, no inefficient blanket techniques. Just targeted support that maximized return on mana investment. Mana expenditure for the wolverine's counter technique was even less than what the amphibian was spending on cold generation. Way more effective. It was an execution demonstrating refined control to the point where each action was precise without being excessive. Efficiency maximizing return on mana investment. And the result was that plants not only resisted the cold, but thrived despite conditions that should have been lethal, with their growth accelerating as they found abundant resources that the wolverine deliberately provided. Men observed the development with growing recognition that the strategy that had worked against the mantis was insufficient against an opponent operating on an almost fundamentally different level of sophistication. He would need mastering true ice to deal with something like this. But he wouldn't surrender without fighting either. He ordered using the last card the amphibian had available, a final investment of remaining energy from the completed digestion. The amphibian detonated a massive explosion, not concentrated in a specific area, but distributed throughout its complete body in a manner maximizing harm to roots that had penetrated through its permeable skin. It was an enormous expenditure, consuming all remaining reserves that had been restored by the absorbed beast digestion. But the roots the wolverine had manifested were considerably thicker and more resistant than those the mantis had managed creating. Not delicate structures that an explosion could easily fragment, but robust constructions absorbing detonation energy and redistributing it through the interconnected network. The root system functioned like shock absorbers in a suspension system. Individual components might fail, but the overall structure remained intact by distributing stress across many connection points. Some roots fractured, certainly. Sections more exposed being destroyed by the explosion's force. Maybe 20 to 30% of the root network taking big damage. But the core network remained intact. The majority of the structures survived the assault and were healed and regenerated by the others. Damaged roots regrew at maybe 2 to 3 centimeters per second, using the absorbed mana for repair. And those surviving roots continued extracting mana from the last amphibian's reserves without interruption. The drainage accelerated as the creature exhausted almost all its last strength in a loud and showy technique that hadn't achieved its intended objective. Drain rate even higher as more roots established deeper penetration into the amphibian's body, taking even its form as energy for the wolverine. Men couldn't return his beast, which was trapped in the thick network now. The roots had penetrated too deeply, almost integrated with it, and hugging the mana form to not let it go even if the tamer willed it. The amphibian form eventually disappeared completely when they stole sufficient energy that it could no longer maintain coherence. 50 tons of mass gone like they were from a ghost. Master Yang's hand rose. Second partial victory. Team run. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Appreciation for the Wolverine's overwhelming display of elemental mastery, but also some disappointment that the conclusion had been too fast and less dramatic than the extended tactical chess match between the mantis and the amphibian. Sometimes superior power just won. No clever reversals, nor hidden techniques. Just better capacity applied decisively until the opponent had no options remaining. Rin allowed himself a slight smile as the Wolverine remained manifested, ready for whatever came next. 1 down, 3 to go, and Luna's wolf still waited. That would be the next difficult eater, like Min's problematic one had just been for a while. Chapter 895, Taming the 5th Year, Attrition Chaos. The battle was far from finished. Min still had his second beast available, and that beast would be his blue serpent that had been Min's companion for 5 years already, a creature that had grown considerably and that had gained improved control in the base element it shared with the amphibian, water. Rin observed while Min prepared to invoke his serpent, his mind evaluating what he remembered about the creature's capabilities. The serpent was more agile than the amphibian, less defensive tank, and more healing support or quick attacker. The water control it had developed was sophisticated for a Silver 3 beast, which was respectable if not exceptional. It was now gold, and Rin knew little about what was better in the new rank. But Rin doubted Min had a better way to counteract the elemental weakness to wood than what he developed with his amphibian. The cold technique had been a brilliant innovation requiring a boost, a capability the serpent didn't possess because its specialization was different, and the Wolverine had already completely prepared the field. The arena was covered with roots and vines that had survived the exchange with the amphibian and that were now established deeply throughout the entire ground. More importantly, it had recovered considerable energy by absorbing mana from the amphibian during the final moments. Its reserves were close to being complete thanks to the resource transfer from the defeated opponent. Wolverine starting reserves, essentially back to full capacity. It was a setup favoring Rin almost ridiculously. The serpent would enter a field where the element to which it had its greatest weakness already dominated the terrain, facing an opponent that was fresh and prepared, almost improved by the previous exchange that had allowed it to set the plant trap. Simple logic suggested victory would be quick and practically guaranteed unless Min revealed something completely unexpected that changed the dynamics as dramatically as the revelation of cold manipulation capability had done. Rin allowed a small smile to touch his lips while observing Min invoke his serpent with determination that hadn't diminished despite the amphibian's loss. His friend wasn't a person who surrendered easily when he could show off before people, and he probably had something planned even if the situation seemed unfavorable. Min invoked the blue serpent with confidence that hadn't reduced despite the amphibian's loss. But when the creature fully materialized in the arena, Rin noticed something immediately that was different from what he remembered a few months ago. The serpent had become strangely purple. It wasn't the dark and ominous purple that Leora's wisp fire was gradually adopting as it matured toward manifestation closer to the bash's negative spiritual nature. It was a considerably lighter tone, almost lilac, a coloration mixing with the blue base in a manner creating an iridescent effect when light reflected off the scales. It was a subtle but notable change for someone who had observed the beast's development during most of its existence. Water serpents typically maintained consistent blue tones as they advanced through the ranks, with variation within the spectrum, but rarely derivation toward different colors. And lilacs suggested influence from some additional element, mixing with the aquatic base, an alteration that could indicate specialized evolution or something more experimental. Ran felt a mental sigh forming as he processed that implication. Of course, it would be Min who had a beast with anomalous coloration, suggesting experimentation with the limits of what conventional cultivation that Ren recommended permitted. Min had been one of the last to bring his main beast to gold, very late, a lag that didn't come from being the last to start but from disorder, something fundamental in how he approached most aspects of life. He was an absolute chaos agent in the room he shared with Run, Taro, and Lu, a living contrast with the other three who maintained organized personal spaces and structured routines. They were always scolding him for leaving everything scattered around, clothes accumulating in corners, study materials dispersed across his desk in a disordered order that only he could navigate, equipment abandoned wherever he'd finished using it last instead of properly stored. It was a constant source of minor friction that never escalated to serious conflict, but that definitely tested his roommate's patience. Ren, Taro, and Lu maintained their room quarters with almost military order. Beds made every morning, clothes folded or hung, books arranged by subject or alphabetically, equipment cleaned and stored in designated locations. Min's quarter looked like a hurricane had passed through and decided to take up permanent residence. Somehow his chaos never quite spilled into the other spaces. He had enough consideration for at least that. But within his own territory, entropy reigned supreme. Men complained frequently that they were the weird ones, and that normal people at that age weren't so square, that teenagers should have a certain level of chaos instead of living like premature adults obsessed with perfect order. Lou insisted that the best tamers by the nature of cultivation had to be orderly. Cultivation required discipline, discipline required structure, and structure required order. Therefore, order equaled a tamer success. The logic was ironclad in Lou's mind. But men argued there was sufficient time to become boring and structured when they were older, that the present was for experimentation and spontaneity. We'll have 200 years to be organized if we reach gold rank, he'd say. Can't I enjoy for like 10 more years before that? And honestly, in a certain way, he had a valid point that the others recognized, even though they didn't admit it frequently, and especially not in front of him. For Ren, Taro, and Lou, Min was who gave flavor to the boring parts of the day. His random occurrences that interrupted the monotony of routine. His comments that made them laugh when tension became oppressive. Or simply providing someone a scold when they needed an outlet for some frustration that as young people they couldn't appropriately direct toward other sources. It was a strange but functional dynamic, a balance where Min's chaotic personality provided necessary counterweight to the others' ordered inclinations. Without him, the room would be considerably more boring, even if it would also be cleaner and more organized. And relevant to the present situation, Ren could understand why the serpent would have an unexpected color. Chapter 896, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition Chaos 2. Min was also practically the only one among Ren's close companions whom Ren helped most directly in being so creative with his cultivation approach. Most called it reckless, an accusation that was born when Min didn't follow Ren's novel methods to the letter, but experimented with small variations that could have unpredictable consequences. Already following Ren's method was a novelty in principle. Why be crazy enough to change even that? But Ren knew that the characterization of reckless wasn't completely fair. Min wasn't as foolish as he appeared superficially. Behind the apparent chaos was a mind processing information carefully before making those decisions that others dismissed as impulsive. Min always consulted multiple sources before implementing changes to his beast cultivation. He read ancient texts that most considered too esoteric to be worth the effort. He spoke with instructors like Wei about minute details of elemental mechanics. And most importantly, he came to Ren himself frequently to discuss potential results that one change or another could entail in a species based on its mana patterns and development. They were conversations Ren genuinely valued because they forced logical articulation of principles that would otherwise remain implicit in his mind. Having to explain why a certain method was risky required breaking down reasoning in ways that clarified his own understanding as much as it educated men. Ren had explained repeatedly during those discussions that the path to maximum potential was narrow, narrower than most appreciated, and that he himself didn't know everything because his knowledge didn't extend far enough yet to map the complete territory that beasts could eventually reach. Platinum for now. He didn't even know the best routes in Diamond rank. You could get stuck while watching others ascend to Diamond in the future, Ren had warned during one of the more serious conversations they'd had. Small changes might have an even greater effect in subsequent phases that I myself don't know about. I can assure you that certain variations won't affect your potential until Platinum, which is the maximum rank known to me for now. But I can't guarantee that those same changes won't create limitations in phases beyond that. It was honesty about his own knowledge's limits, an admission to a friend that even having had access to enormous information, there were territories remaining unmapped because that same information hadn't explored every possibility. Ren gave examples frequently to illustrate the concept in ways men could fully understand the implications. The Wolverine was a perfect case for demonstration. A creature that could be cultivated with specialization in a specific element, a choice that would change development style, but wouldn't affect the fundamental capacity to reach superior ranks as long as the B space was respected. As long as the species foundations are maintained correctly, Wren had explained, the Wolverine will reach platinum regardless of which element you choose as primary. That's true according to what I know so far. But if I later learn that only certain elements can reach diamond or greater potential, then perhaps only the multi-elemental line was correct all along, for example. And we would have constrained growth by choosing something else without knowing it. It was the uncertainty making experimentation risky, even when it seemed safe based on present knowledge. Because you didn't know what you didn't know until it was too late to reverse decisions made years earlier. But worse than possible elemental limitations was the possibility of species divergence. Wren was the cure to the situation the city had lived with for so long. The permanent species trap that had constrained generations of tamers. If you took one of the multiple permanent species routes, then it was the end. That was the nightmare scenario Wren had emphasized multiple times as the reason why following the base to the letter was generally safer than experimentation. If your serpent became a white salamander at gold rank, for example, Wren had explained with seriousness communicating the warning's importance, then its growth limit would be gold 3 and nothing more. You'd receive a strong immediate power increase because you've reached the peak of development in a permanent species, and salamanders are powerful creatures. But the potential would end there forever. You could only mature your beast going forward, refining what it already has, but never improving its rank beyond gold 3. It was a trade-off that some wild beasts in certain niches made deliberately. A sacrifice of long-term potential in favor of immediate power, allowing them to compete in their situations present. But in Tamer's case, Wren thought it was a decision that should be made with complete understanding of what was being abandoned, not accidentally through experimentation that went wrong as it had always been. Min was still very daring in that aspect, a characteristic Wren admired even while warning about risks because he had the adventurous spirit that Wren also admired. Min had genuine aspirations to discover small optimizations, staying on the best path, but that weren't perfectly generic for that path. He wanted personalization, expressing his individuality without compromising maximum potential. If a beast has maximum potential in diamond with 3 elements, Min had argued during one of their discussions, then I want to be able to choose those 3 specific elements if that choice doesn't affect the final rank. Not simply accept the first 3 that appear, but select the combination adapting to my style. It was a reasonable philosophy Wren couldn't completely dismiss. If there really was space for at least elemental personalization within the limits that maximum potential imposed, then it was worth exploring. The problem was determining exactly where those limits were without accidentally crossing them in the exploration process. And now, observing the serpent with anomalous lilac coloration entering the arena, Wren suspected Min had been experimenting in ways that perhaps had pushed beyond what Wren would have recommended if he'd been consulted about the last specific changes. The serpent that should preserve characteristic light blue coloration, even at gold 1, had clearly diverged from that standard. Its scales gleamed with a tone suggesting additional elemental influence mixing with the aquatic base, an alteration that could be beneficial specialization or could be the first sign of divergence that would eventually limit growth. Chapter 897, Taming the 5th Year, Attrition, Chaos 3. Wren observed while the serpent appeared in the arena covered with roots the Wolverine had established. The creature seemed aware of the danger the vegetation represented, coiling cautiously in a defensive position rather than charging directly. But cautiousness wasn't sufficient when the complete field was so saturated with threats that couldn't be avoided simply by being careful. The roots responded to the serpent's presence, fast permitting no evasion by their sheer numbers. They coiled around the long coiled body, still with dozens of contact points, establishing simultaneously as the vegetation took advantage of every centimeter of exposed surface. Within seconds, the serpent was surrounded almost as completely as the amphibian had been, with constriction preventing movement while the roots began the parasitic drainage process. It seemed that despite the weird color, it would be a quick victory, replicating the success against the amphibian. Same element beast. Same fundamental weakness. So same inevitable result when facing complete wood dominance in a field now specifically prepared to exploit that vulnerability. But then the serpent exploded, not figuratively in the sense of sudden, ordinary, subjective, or moral release. It literally detonated in fire in all directions, a heat liberation so violent and unexpected that the wolverine instinctively retreated several meters. It can't be, Rin thought with shock. Can it do the same as the amphibian? Had Min developed a similar explosive technique for his second beast, chemistry converting defense into counterattack? No. Rin and the audience realized simultaneously as they watched the incinerated vegetation and processed what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't a biochemical explosion like the amphibian had used, no reaction of controlled secretions detonating underwater manipulation. It was something different that explained the anomalous coloration Run had noticed immediately. The serpent, now clearly visible after the explosion had dispersed the roots that had tried trapping it, had a new elemental characteristic it definitely hadn't possessed the last time Ren had seen it at Silver 3. A strange film of red tissue crowned around its head like a lion's mane, but composed of fins instead of hair, a structure pulsing with energy. The fins were arranged in a circular pattern around the head and upper neck. They glowed faintly with internal heat, and the explosion it had just executed hadn't been water or any aquatic technique of any type. It had been a detonation of fire, genuine flames that had burned the plants in direct contact, intense heat that had caused vegetation to wither and release its grip before parasitic drainage could even establish itself appropriately. The roots within 3 to 4 meters of the serpent were charred, blackened to the point where they crumbled when the serpent moved. The root network that had been attempting capture was destroyed in that single burst. Rin slapped his face with the palm of his hand, a gesture communicating his newfound exasperation, but maybe even reluctant admiration and absolute recognition that of course this was exactly the type of thing men would do. Of course, it had to be men. If anyone in their entire generation was going to force two completely opposing elements into a beast without appropriate balance between them, it would be men without any doubt. The chaos agent who rejected convention simply because it was convention, who experimented without sufficient fear of consequences that would have stopped more sensible people. Water and fire, elements that opposed each other fundamentally in almost every aspect of the elemental interaction. Even worse than light and darkness in some respects, because the opposition was messier, less direct and immediate. Combining both in the same creature without having others as balance in the mana system was asking for problems on multiple levels. An imbalance that established theory said would result in instability that would eventually limit growth or cause a dozen other problems that Tex warned against with emphasis bordering on hysteria. Standard cultivation theory was extremely clear on this point. Opposing elements required multiple compensation mechanisms or mediating elements for stability. Water and fire needed earth to ground both, or some other moderating influence. Direct combination without mediation, not recommended. Probability of success in a stable system, maybe 1 to 5% according to historical records. Probability of failure causing permanent problems and some system damage, maybe 30 to 40%. Probability of subtle long-term problems, maybe 50 to 60%. But men had apparently decided warnings were optional suggestions rather than absolute limits. And after Run used his mana eyes to take a good look at the now likely messy system of Min's beast, all seemed fine. Somehow he'd managed to cultivate his serpent possessing both elements simultaneously, the capacity to generate water and fire without one completely canceling the other at all. Or so it seemed for now. Ren would have to see if Min had truly managed to integrate them properly, or if this was just a superficial combination that would collapse under pressure. The serpent coiled in the center of the scorched zone it had created, with flames still flickering along parts of its body. Not consuming it, but dancing across the scales, while the water-blue coloration and fire-red tissue created a visual contrast that was striking if somewhat unnerving. Min stood at his end of the arena with an expression that was equal parts pride and mischief. He knew exactly how shocking this revelation was for Run. Had probably been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it for maximum dramatic impact. Surprised, Min called across the arena with a grin that suggested he was enjoying Rin's reaction immensely. "Bet you didn't see that coming." Rin lowered his hand from his face and stared at his friend with an expression difficult to parse. Exasperation, certainly. Concern about potential long-term consequences, definitely. But also something else, something that felt like excitement despite the rational part of his mind screaming about how risky this was. Why was he so animated and happy? Had Rin's own adventurous spirit also been provoked by this? Because objectively, this was terrible cultivation practice. Opposing elements without mediation. Specialization that risked permanent species divergence. Experimentation that could lock Min's serpent forever if the balance collapsed. But subjectively, it was working. Right now, in this moment, that chaotic serpent was functioning well. And that was fascinating in ways Rin couldn't completely suppress despite knowing he should probably be more disapproving of the chaos his friend represented. Chapter 898, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition Chaos 4. It was absurd. It was reckless. It was dangerous in ways that probably wouldn't manifest entirely until later development phases. And it was absolutely brilliant in the pure audacity of attempting it despite every authority saying it was a bad idea. The audience erupted in conversations, spectators processing what they'd just witnessed. A beast with opposing elements wasn't something they saw frequently. It was a rarity bordering on impossibility according to conventional knowledge. Min had apparently beaten those odds. Or at least, he'd beaten them so far. The real test would come when the serpent attempted advancing beyond Gold 1 toward Gold 2, and the strain on its dual-element structure increased exponentially without making it immediately collapse into elemental chaos. Min smiled widely from his position, clearly enjoying the shock the revelation had caused. "I spent months working on this. It was totally worth it just to see everyone's expressions. And honestly, the result was impressive even if the method had been risky in the extreme." "You're an idiot," Rin responded with a tone carrying affection mixed with criticism. "But I have to admit, it's an interesting innovation. Though we're going to have a long discussion about the risks you took after the exams finish." Min shrugged with carelessness, communicating he'd anticipated exactly that response. "A long conversation is a small price for having a beast that can do this," he replied while ordering the serpent to demonstrate the capabilities that the element combination provided. Or rather, when the combination fails to maintain perfect balance and creates unstable resonance. A powerful explosion generated by elemental instability eliminated even more plants around the serpent. Not controlled detonation like the amphibian's chemical reactions, but rather a consequence of water and fire energies briefly clashing instead of coexisting peacefully. The explosion happened spontaneously when the serpent's internal balance shifted too far in one direction. The instability provided additional offensive capability through unpredictable detonations. Fascinating and dangerous. Quintessentially Min. And Rin observed with renewed attention, recognizing that the battle he'd assumed would be an easy victory had just become considerably more complicated. Min seemed to have awakened a genuine appetite for explosions that Rin recognized as perfectly aligned with his friend's chaotic nature. It wasn't simply their tactical effectiveness making explosive techniques attractive to Min, but also the theatrical element they provided. Visual and auditory spectacle, capturing attention in ways that more subtle methods never would achieve. They undoubtedly suited the personality that thrived being the center of attention. The need to make others laugh that manifested in combat approach as much as in social interactions. Each explosion was a statement as much as a technique. Communication of, "Look at me. I'm doing something incredible," that resonated with the audience in ways more reserved tamers rarely achieved. The crowd's reaction confirmed it. All spectators were focused entirely on Min's Serpent despite Ren's Wolverine being an ultra-rare beast too. His theatrical approach to combat drew eyes and held attention through pure spectacle. But appreciation of Min's style didn't change the tactical reality Ren faced. With a serpent capable of using fire to burn vegetation before parasitic drainage could establish, he could no longer take advantage of the wood field that had invested considerable resources creating during the battle against the amphibian. All that mana spent establishing the root and vine network was essentially lost now that the opponent had a perfect countermeasure. But Ren wasn't a person who wasted resources just because the initial strategy became unviable. Instead of simply abandoning plants that no longer serve an aggressive purpose, he decided to absorb the energy remaining in the system and store it underground where he could access it later if the situation changed. It was an investment in future flexibility, keeping options open rather than completely committing to a single unique approach. The Wolverine executed the technique Ren had developed specifically for this type of resource management, with elemental control directing mana from surface roots toward deep storage, where enemy interference would be minimal. The mechanism worked through creating underground mana reservoirs. The roots extending 2 to 3 meters below the surface converted from active combat tools into passive storage vessels. Mana flowed from dying surface-burning vegetation down through the root network into concentrated nodes positioned at strategic locations beneath the arena floor. Not perfect storage, some mana loss was inevitable during transfer, but significantly better than allowing the energy to simply dissipate when all the plants were destroyed. The arena surface cleaned gradually as vegetation retracted below ground, a process taking only seconds but recovering a significant percentage of energy that would otherwise have been wasted against the fire. And with the field neutralized and resources partially recovered, Ren decided it was time for something he genuinely enjoyed when he had the opportunity. The experimentation phase where he could systematically test the enemy beast capabilities without pressure of immediate victory being the sole priority. Min had revealed a fascinating situation with a water and fire combination without stabilizer, and Ren wanted to understand exactly how it functioned before committing to the final strategy. This was what separated good tamers from great ones. Good tamers saw an unexpected capability and immediately tried overwhelming it. Great tamers saw an unexpected capability and studied it first, extracting maximum information before deciding on optimal counter strategy. And Ren, despite the competitive context, was fundamentally a researcher at heart. The opportunity to observe a functioning dual opposing element system was too valuable to waste on immediate aggression. He began with the most obvious element to test: fire against fire. The Wolverine launched a flame projectile toward the serpent, a technique that was refined but not particularly massive in terms of invested energy. A fireball approximately 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter, approximately 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius at the core. It was a test more than a serious attack. Observation of how Min's beast would respond to the element it shared. The response was revealing. The fire the Wolverine projected wasn't just resisted by water the serpent could generate. Chapter 899, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition, Balance, Chaos. The serpent's mouth opened. The fireball entered. The fire the Wolverine projected wasn't just resisted by the water the serpent could generate, but was literally absorbed. Flame energy was controlled on contact and integrated into the creature's internal system without causing appreciable damage. Instead of burning its tissue or triggering a defensive reaction of water generation from the serpent, the fire simply joined the existing flame energy already circulating through the serpent's body. No damage, just seamless integration. It was an immunity exceeding simple resistance, a new capacity to take a hostile elemental mana and convert it into a resource that strengthened rather than weakened. An absorption efficiency of nearly 100% for the fire element too. Min had two beasts with absorption capability now. The amphibian could consume defeated opponents to increase power. The serpent could absorb some elemental attacks to add to and replenish its energy. Different mechanisms. Same strategic advantage of sustainability through enemy resource conversion. Rin nodded with a partial understanding of the underlying principle. It made sense that a beast cultivated specifically to balance water and fire would develop the capacity to absorb both elements as part of maintaining internal equilibrium. Perhaps it was a natural consequence of the need to constantly process opposing energies, an adaptation converting a potential weakness from its fire into a distinctive strength. If the serpent couldn't efficiently absorb and integrate both elements, the internal conflict between them would tear its system order apart from the inside. So absorption wasn't just a cool new capability. It was a survival mechanism. The only way a dual opposing element system could function long-term was if it could process energy from both elements and maintain balance. Therefore, the next test was water. The Wolverine generated a torrent directed toward the serpent. Not a massive attack again, to save mana. Rin observed carefully to see if water could extinguish the external fire dancing around and crowning the serpent's head in the mane of red fins. But the water passed through the flames without extinguishing them. It was an interaction defying ordinary elemental logic, where water and fire canceled each other mutually. The water flowed through the flame-wreathed fins, touched the burning tissue, and made contact with the surfaces that should have either extinguished the flames or been evaporated away by the heat. And nothing happened. The fire continued burning. The water continued flowing. They occupied the same space without apparent conflict. Peaceful coexistence where elements that should annihilate each other simply existed together. Min's fire seemed to literally get along with water. Not just tolerate it, but actively cooperate with it in ways that shouldn't be possible according to standard elemental theory. And like with fire, the serpent absorbed the water the Wolverine had projected. Integration without resistance, communicating that the aquatic element was as welcome as the flame one. It had a perfect symmetry in absorption capability, a balance treating both opposing elements with complete parity. Neither favored, neither rejected. Both equally integrated into the system, maintaining the serpent's existence. Rin processed observations rapidly, his mind working through implications at accelerated speed. The absorption clearly didn't affect the serpent's internal balance negatively. That fact was more impressive considering conventional theory suggested adding a third element to stabilize the precarious equilibrium that should be maintaining both contrary ones operating simultaneously. But Min's serpent appeared to violate that principle. It absorbed fire without the fire overwhelming the water component. It absorbed water without the water extinguishing the fire component. Somehow, it was maintaining a dynamic equilibrium despite continuous input from both sides. How? Rin focused his mana perception more sharply, observing the serpent's internal flows with detail that would normally be invasive, but that Min probably expected given the battle context where secrets inevitably revealed themselves. And what Rin saw was a masterpiece of elemental juggling exceeding what he would have anticipated Min could achieve even with his extensive consultations to multiple sources. The internal rotation of the system intertwined the two elements in a perfect counterspin. Water and fire rotated around a central elongated core in opposite directions in a manner creating dynamic stability. Not static equilibrium where elements remained separated, but an active balance where they were constantly engaging in patterns feeding each other rather than creating destructive chaos. And the rotation speed adjusted automatically depending on the relative quantity of each element. When one exceeded the other in volume, the spin accelerated for the more abundant element while feeding energy to the scarcer one. This process redistributed resources until both were again in parity. The feedback mechanism worked through a pressure differential. More fire meant higher temperature. Higher temperature created expansion. Expansion increased rotational inertia, and the increased inertia accelerated water rotation through coupling. And the inverse worked equally well. Evaporation restored balance. It was a self-correcting system maintaining equilibrium without requiring constant deliberate intervention from men, that allowed the technique to be usable in combat rather than simply theoretical, requiring full attention at all times to prevent catastrophic failure. Actual combat usage with active techniques meant sustainability became critical. It was brilliant. Ren had to admire it, even while recognizing the risks the approach implied. The engineering was sophisticated beyond what he'd expected from Min's generally chaotic approach to cultivation. This required understanding of mana rotational dynamics and feedback systems, required tons of careful adjustment to find the exact criteria allowing stable operation. Min had done his homework, had consulted sources, had probably driven Wei absolutely crazy with questions about elemental interaction theory and stability mechanics that were not even known. And he'd succeeded in creating something that shouldn't work according to standard theory, but that demonstrably did work in practice. That was innovation, real innovation. Not following established paths, but finding new routes that conventional wisdom said were impossible. Ren felt complex emotions processing the observation. Pride in his friend's accomplishment, concern about long-term risks, fascination with the mechanics, and maybe even competitive irritation that Min had developed something this sophisticated without revealing it during their regular discussions. But admiration didn't change the fact that Ren needed to find a way to win the battle. Chapter 900, Taming the Fifth Year, Attrition, Balanced Chaos. 2. Having eliminated fire and water as viable attack options, since both would just feed the serpent's reserves, he assessed the remaining elements the Wolverine had available. Earth seemed the most promising option. It had no inherent weakness to fire or water. Wind, and would then be weak too. Earth versus the dual water-fire system seemed to have no obvious interaction disadvantage. Earth was just neutral, solid. It didn't burn easily, didn't dissolve easily. It just was. And that impartiality was exactly what made it effective. The Serpent's sophisticated elemental balance system had no special mechanisms for handling Earth-based attacks beyond the standard options any Gold 1 beast possessed. Light and darkness could serve as well. They operated in a different spectrum from the thermal and fluid interactions water and fire dominated. But they were slightly more expensive in mana terms for comparable effectiveness. That additional cost came from the complexity of manipulating energies that most beasts couldn't naturally perceive or interact with. And Ren preferred conserving that investment, considering Luna's battle still waited after Min's defeat. That confrontation would almost certainly require extensive mana usage. He didn't want to face it without much of it, so he decided to defeat Min with Earth for now. It was an element providing sufficient power without draining reserves he needed preserving for the exam's final phases. He could experiment more with the new interactions between other elements and the Serpent's balance system later, when competition pressure didn't limit how much he could invest in pure curiosity, and couldn't scold Min for taking large risks without warning or asking him, even if it was slightly hypocritical given Ren's own tendencies. The Wolverine changed its approach completely, abandoning any other elemental techniques in favor of Earth manipulation that exploited mass and density as primary weapons. Rocks emerged from the ground and launched toward the Serpent with speed, converting fragments into dangerous projectiles. It was bombardment, forcing constant evasion instead of the tranquil absorption the Serpent had been enjoying until now. Earth wasn't absorbed. The Serpent's dual-element system had no mechanism for processing solid matter imbued with Earth mana like Leora had. Fire and water were energies that could be integrated into the rotational balance. Earth was just mass. Heavy, solid, unyielding mass that had to be dodged or deflected. Min responded with the creativity that was characteristic of his combat approach. The explosions he generated weren't simply defensive, but also offensive, and he was also using them to propel the Serpent in unexpected directions, with calculated detonations providing thrust complementing the creature's natural mobility. It was an innovative use of a technique that most would have limited to direct attack. Transformation of limitation into advantage through intelligent application. But the tactical situation shifted immediately. From sustainable attrition through absorption to resource-depleting evasion through continuous movement. Every dodge cost stamina, every deflection cost mana, and the Wolverine had vastly deeper reserves to sustain the bombardment than the Serpent had to sustain the defense. But the explosions were still strong and dangerous. When the Serpent's internal balance destabilized, it could choose where the resulting explosion manifested along its body. The Serpent began moving in 3 dimensions rather than just 2, diving fast downward and sideways with dorsal bursts, creating zigzag patterns that made predicting its trajectory nearly impossible. But the mana cost increased proportionally. The Serpent didn't only use explosions, though. It could not only break the balance to attack, but rather improve it. It began launching projectiles that were chaotic in the best sense of the word, combinations of fire and water spinning around themselves in patterns creating impressive visual effects. When they impacted, the effects were dramatic. The water shell burst on contact, dispersing in a spray, and then the fire core detonated, creating a secondary explosion. And more than just power efficiency, there was something else happening. Rin observed with growing interest as the rotation of the 2 elements in projectiles generated light. Flashes being released by the interaction between opposing energies in ways approximating combination into an extra element. Almost light, but slightly more inclined toward heat, and with physical properties more of matter than energy. Not the same true elemental light that Run could manifest through direct control. Not quite the same phenomenon he created when elemental ice was born through deliberate fusion of wind and water. But related, a naturally emergent property arising from the dynamics men had created rather than consciously designed capability. The light generation mechanism was fascinating from a theoretical perspective, and observing that helped Rin understand something about his own capabilities that had been on the edge of consciousness without crystallizing completely. These new way elements interacted to produce emergent effects, properties not present in individual components, but appearing when combined appropriately. That was a principle applying not only to fire and water, but to any element combination if interactions were understood deeply enough. Elemental ice wasn't just frozen water. It was an emergent mana property arising from water and wind interaction under specific conditions. Its crystalline structure, unique thermal properties, and the way it reflected and refracted light. None of those were the same as normal ice made from normal water alone. Min's pseudo-light wasn't a deliberate creation. It was an emergent property of fire-water rotation at sufficient speed under control conditions. The light appeared not because Min commanded it, but because the physical laws governing elemental interaction produced it as natural consequence. And if fire-water produced light as an emergent property, what other combinations might produce unexpected effects? It was an insight opening an entire new avenue for elemental research. Suggestion that elements could be combined not just through direct fusion, but through creating conditions where emergent properties naturally arose from their interaction. It was a valuable insight into a new way of applying elemental combinations that Rin filed for later exploration. But for now, he needed concentrating on finishing the battle that had extended longer than pure efficiency would dictate. Not excessive by competitive battle standards, but longer than the conclusion Run had projected when he'd first seen the Serpent's vulnerabilities. Min's innovations had bought time, had created complications requiring adaptive responses rather than simple, overwhelming force. But time bought wasn't a victory achieved, and the Serpent's reserves were approaching critical levels despite the creative techniques extending its sustainability. Sorry, everyone. We had a power outage right around the usual update time, so I couldn't finish earlier. Everything's back to normal now. The past few days have been a bit slower, but we'll be speeding things up again very soon.